Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about how indie studios can build transmedia worlds. So, indie studios often focus solely on their game, but what if their world could extend beyond the screen? So, in today's episode, our guest shares his expertise on transmedia storytelling, how indie developers can expand their IP across multiple platforms like comics, books, and film to build stronger brands and deeper player engagement. So, that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and we're back. And today with us, I have Chris Mifsud. Chris, how's it going, man?
It's going great. How are you doing today?
Good. I tripped up a little bit trying to say his name. I got so excited because I said it mostly correct, but I paused for a minute.
It's all good.
Anyways, Chris, it's great to have you here. Really excited, especially because of the topic we're going to be discussing today. But first and foremost, folks, for those of you who don't know Chris, he is the founder and CEO of Play on Words Studios. And I'm sure in a moment you can share a little bit more details, but you're also working on a game, Shadow City Mysteries, a Clockwork Noir. That sounds like something right up my alley. In addition to that, you also, you're a leadership and management consultant and of Press Start Leadership. And in light of that, you are also a podcaster, a fellow podcaster with the Press Start Leadership podcast. So lots of cool, interesting things going on. And please, if you could, take a moment to share us about, Play on Words Studios and, this cool project that you're working on.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Play on Words Studios. We're based in Malta, but we're an internationally distributed team of folks that I've worked with over the last 25 years on different projects. And then we're a video game studio, but mostly we're a transmedia studio. And I know that we'll go into more details about that later. But the IP brand we're working on right now is Shadow City Mysteries, and one of the projects is Shadow Mysteries: A Clockwork Noir. It's a narrative adventure game that's kind of like Blade Runner by way of Lovecraft Country, set in a Frank Miller Sin City kind of world. So think black and white with punches of metallics in the world with a new game plus twist, right? So the idea of our game is that instead of making the enemies harder, because it's a narrative adventure game, we change the story. So we intend you to play through the game 3 times. So the first time it's a mystery, second time it's a conspiracy, and the third time it's a supernatural thriller. So
what?
Yeah,
that sounds
crazy.
Cool.
But in addition to that, we have a tabletop RPG, which we did a backer kit for back in the spring, and that's coming out later this year in the same world. So you can run your own games and adventures in the world. And we also have a set of visual novels coming out that's Shadow City Mysteries case files. So, again, more supplemental stuff that we'll talk about and how we get around to doing all that. Because as everyone always says when we talk about this, it's like, that sounds really ambitious. And it is. But at the same time, not so hard. And then just on the other side of things, like, yeah, I do consulting and mentorship, and I've been doing that for even longer. And that's with the Press Start Leadership. And the podcast is Press Start Leadership Podcast. So pretty simple. Keeps it together, right?
Yeah, so. No, that's great. I mean, lots of cool things that you're going on so many fronts. And I know we're going to be, diving in quite a bit on the, transmedia side of things, but still the other work you do, that sounds really exciting and everything else too, because I do feel that we need a lot more kind of leadership and management consultant guides, people out there kind of with this, because these things are important, and it's always hard to find good mentors too. So definitely glad that you're, contributing to that and helping others, level up, as they say. All right. Well, with that said, we got to know you a little bit, but let's get to know you a little bit more. And how we're going to do that, Chris, is with the Q Box round, folks. So for those of you who aren't familiar, just a few random questions I prepared here for Chris today. So Chris, the question I have for you now to kick off is, are you ready for the Q Box round?
As ready as I can be.
Excellent. All right. First is, what was your childhood favorite game?
Childhood favorite game is a split. I grew up with the Atari 2600 and the ColecoVision. The Atari 2600 at my house, and my dad and I would play Atlantis. In fact, we played it so much that we ended up having to get a second cartridge because the first cartridge burned out. And then On the ColecoVision, whenever I go visit my brother, who's like 15 years older than me, he had Smurfs, and it was the game that I'd always force him to put into the machine so I could play. So those are the childhood memories. Also, that dates me to be pretty old. So, but yeah, but not so hard that I'm talking Pong. Yeah.
But though those are good ones, and sounds like quite fun memories too. Next is, what's the your most influential or inspiring game?
That's going to be Ogre Battle on the Super NES.
Mm.
It was the coolest game like at the time because it had like a huge map that you folded out when you actually used to buy physical copies of it. And then on the other side of the huge map was all the different armies and how they could transform. So you got fighters that could turn into werewolves, that could turn into vampires, and priests that could turn into angels, and so forth. Had multiple endings, and it had a really cool like beginning where you selected like tarot cards to decide like who you were and everything like that. It was ambitious. And as we'll go further in, for its time, it was very ambitious. Now looking back, it probably wasn't as ambitious as it was, but it was definitely inspiring to me to see somebody try to take on such a large challenge, which hadn't really been done at the time. So yeah,
I had similar experiences with the NES copy of Final Fantasy, and
Final Fantasy one too. Yeah.
And Chrono Trigger, and to this
Chrono Trigger is the one that the Chrono Trigger is the other one that when you think about like, wow, that was a lot of time spent on things that majority of player base will never see, but
right.
But everyone claims that they did, right?
Like yeah. And to this day, I regret using that wall putty to put up that as a poster in my room because it left all those stains in the corners.
Oh, it's true. It's true.
At any rate, no, that's a good one. Last but not least, and the staple here on the show is, what game are you playing now?
Avowed, because it just came out this week, right? So, but I didn't get very far. Like, I'm like, not spoiler alert. I'm at the dock, the first like about to go meet. Like, I made it through the tutorial. So, it's been a busy week. So I haven't been able to play as much of it as I would like to. But that's the current flavor flav.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. Great stuff. And now that we've got to learning a little bit more, let's dive into the conversation here. And like I led in with the intro, folks, we're going to be talking about how indie studios can build transmedia worlds. And, this is something I'm always excited about. I know we've talked about this on the show in some capacity, but, like you hear me say all the time, it's all about different perspectives. And I think Chris has a really cool one, especially with his take on things, what he's currently doing with his existing projects, all great stuff. So enough of me gabbing here. Let's kick things off with this. Chris, how do you define transmedia, and what do you think it's important? Like, what do you think, why is it important for indie studios to consider?
Sure. So like transmedia to me is just basically taking an IP or a brand and finding and putting it into different media, right? So across multiple medias. So whether that's video games, movies, animations, comic books, role-playing games, anything else. I focus on the narrative mostly, but there's other, forms of doing that. Music could be soundtracks, could be other things, right? That all included in the transmedia side of things. And I think that people overlook that, right? That transmedia, it's media, and it's how you basically present your IP and brand and get it across to many different audiences, right? And so you might, the great thing about transmedia, and the reason why I think it's important, is that you're basically your IP and your brand is the most valuable thing you have, right? Besides the other products. And you never know what's going to resonate with an audience, right? And by be able to put it out on different forms of media, you give it exposure across. And that Venn diagram oftentimes is very, like almost a circle, but sometimes it's not. And so, the folks that like will buy your tabletop RPG that's based on your world might be 100% of the people that will buy your video game, but maybe not. And then some people will buy the comic books or buy a book or an extended visualization of your. Yeah, that's close enough. Whatever.
I've been jumping the words all day today, so keep going, man.
of your works and so forth. And if you have the time and the ability to basically get music composition that fits your world and is your world, and people register with it, right? Like, iconic music has been in the video game industry for forever, right? You hear the Zelda theme, you hear the Mario Brothers theme, you hear Final Fantasy we mentioned, right? Like all these things are part of the and it goes on to now they have entire orchestras, right? Traveling the world and performing these musical pieces for people, and that's part of that transmedia experience. So But I think one of the reasons is that I think the more you explore your IP and the more options you give your fans and the people who love your IP opportunities to experience it, you're just rewarding your players. And honestly, by not doing this, you're leaving money on the table. So I feel like a lot of companies wait too long to approach it. And I get it, right? There's risk, right? If you go too hard too fast and there's no audience there for it, then like, what are you doing, right? But I think there's a lot of safe ways and a lot of ways to plan and not build the waste as far as these experiences go, that you're risking as much, right? There's safe ways to do it, smart ways to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I love about you sharing just now too is, looking at it from the perspective of, by doing this or looking at things or at least considering them, you're basically rewarding the players. And I think that's a great way to look at it, because when you look at it from that perspective, right? Let's say you have enough following, there's enough and even if you don't, but let's say focusing on rewarding on the players, by rewarding them, they're also going to be rewarding you, because that means, okay, by giving them these other assets, other experiences that they're going to more likely than not enjoy and have fun with, right? Continuing that experience, it's going to reward you as well, because that can increase your revenue. You are creating new assets, but the assets aren't just self-serving assets; they're serving others as well. Those are the best kind of assets ever, because they're usually, keep growing and everything else. So I think that's a great way to position it, is looking at it as rewarding players, not just as, oh, it's something else to do that we can or can't do, or whatever the risk or whatever else potential limitations we might have when we're thinking about transmedia. In light of that, though, I'm also curious, though, because I'm sure, you touched on it for a moment there, but I'm curious, like, what are some common misconceptions that indie devs have about transmedia? Because I'm sure there's a lot of them out there that might be limiting us from even considering these things.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to, it's time consuming, it's taking away from your main project. It's expensive, right? It's already hard enough to get funding and so forth. So how do you do this within a budget or make time for it? How do you keep it from pulling you away from your main project, right? A lot of folks are like, when I explain to them what we're doing, they're like, that sounds like a lot. Not only is it ambitious, it sounds like, shouldn't you just be focused on one thing? And I'm like, well, okay, fair enough. It's like, I have to give people a little bit of my background, though. Right? I grew up in a comic book store, so I was surrounded by transmedia all my life. My dad owned a comic book store, right? I worked for Disney, so I learned the value of IP, and I learned how you leverage IP and the value of it. And I've worked in video games for over 25 years, and I've part of that being in game design and in production. And for me, I think the best way to approach transmedia is from a production standpoint, right? Like being smart about how you plan out what you're doing. So all of their people's concerns are viable if you're not planning, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it can be expensive, it can be distracting, it can take away from it. But for us, the tabletop RPG came about because, well, most of my team already have experience in tabletop RPGs, but we were already creating a lore and a world that already existed. So it's not like that's extra work. All we're doing is just giving access to that lore and world to the players by putting it into a book and then putting some rules on top of it that we're already familiar with. Sorry.
Keep going.
I was going to say, the visual novels that we're working on, they're 2D, right? Well, we already have fantastic 2D art that a lot of the players won't ever get to see because it's concept art. But we've decided that we're going to take that 2D concept art, that's quite excellent, definitely check it out on our website, and put it into our tabletop RPGs. And then we're also using and leveraging it for visual novels. So we're getting multiple uses out of a lot of the stuff that we're already using. So by planning this and keeping this in mind while we're working, we're not creating stuff that goes to waste or only has like a one use. We have multiple uses for things, right? So we're getting a lot more bang for our buck, and we're being very smart about how we're approaching everything.
Yeah, one of the points I want to call back to that you just mentioned, this quote you said, I'm paraphrasing probably a little bit here, when you said that, people's concerns for doing these things, are definitely viable. And then but if you're not planning for them, right? And yeah. So I think that's so important to consider and think about, because, like with any plan or lack of planning, you're going to have concerns. And it's not to say plan, but don't spend like too much energy and focus just strictly planning, because then you're not moving at all, right?
Well, then you're not moving, correct?
Yeah. But at the same time, like, having those things too is essential, like to a roadmap or some idea of where you're expected to go, because in considering, because if not, of course you're going to have concerns. Of course there's going to seem like more risk because it's like becomes fear of the unknown type stuff, right? So I love that point. And then the other one was multiple uses and being efficient and resourceful with your materials and how else you could repurpose these things, making it more accessible for this transmedia. The other thing I like too, well, I think it's very different, but what you're sharing too with the approach of transmedia is somewhat similar to a strategy I like to share with people in general, which I call the chopping up strategy, which
Mhm.
when people are like, "Oh, I need content to share. How do I just always create and work that machine?" It's like, well, you already probably created a lot of different assets, and maybe
Mhm.
it's media assets. Oh wow, there is some relations here. Media
There is.
assets, right? And it's like you have concept art, like you shared. So you have why can't you share that? Why can't you tell a story about the concept art? What inspired it? What was the process for the artist making? There's any number of things that you could chop up your media that makes up your game. It could be
Mhm.
actually the in-game assets, like, oh, it took me 20 hours to make this stupid tree. That could be a funny conversation. Who knows? But the point is you're sharing this from a transmedia perspective. And look, there's what I'm trying to make the point here, folks, is there's numerous ways you can approach this like very holistically as are talking about the transmedia stuff if you're already doing those things like chopping things up, looking how to be resourceful for with what you already have, so it's not like you're trying to start from scratch every single moment, because that's not very sustainable or conducive. So love that you shared those things. Two really good points there. But you know what, I bet though, even as we're talking about it, there are still some potential challenges that come with this, and maybe we might get stuck somewhere along the way. So in particular, what would you say are some of the challenges now that, like, when it comes to exploring and expanding transmedia, and like how can developers kind of overcome this potential expansion? Because at some point, you might come to a crossroads like, I don't know if I can do this. I mean, is it really just straight down to planning, or what else beyond just the planning that can get people to reach that next level?
So for me, it's always planning. So I used to get, oh, don't worry, Chris always has a plan. So I have multiple plans, but my whole thing is I also know that nothing ever goes to plan, right?
Hmm.
So, but it's always about practice, planning, and so forth. And I'm going to kind of hit a thing that I kind of coach some of my teams with, which is the reason why you plan and you prepare. It's not because it's going to go that way. It's just so that when things go sideways, you have something and you're not starting from zero, right? And so the idea is a lot of times things will go wrong. And because you haven't planned or prepared or thought about other ways, all these different contingencies, you start from scratch again. And that puts you 5 steps back as opposed to just maybe 1 step back, right?
Hmm.
So I do think a lot is in the planning, but that's just me because I'm an overplanner. But at the same time of that, I think the other big hurdle, and and you got to be careful about this, is don't just do it to do it.
Mm.
You got to make sure that when you are doing transmedia, that the media that you're creating fits the IP. You don't want to shoehorn it in. I think transmedia fails when you force it, right? Where you use an art style or a medium that doesn't actually gel with whatever your IP and brand is, or how you're trying to, or the audience you're aiming for, right? Like
Hmm.
if you create a comic book and there's no audience for it, then it's pointless, right? It's just that's wasted effort, right? So do make sure you are doing small things, testing out, like sharing your concept art, your ideas, your stories, or whatever through other social media, right? Create a following, create a community, and actually get their feedback and see if people resonate with it. It's really easy to spend $100 and run some meta, A/B tests and
Hmm.
just see if people would. How much does it cost you? Are you getting 12 cents per click, or are you getting $1 per click? Right? Maybe the dollar per click, it's not really resonating with people. But if you're doing 12 cents, it's not bad. Like, and you never know. Like every like our visual novels in our narrative adventure game, both are on Steam, and they have different audiences. And one, I can say, gets a lot more wish list per day than the other, but the expectation's a lot lower for us on the one that's getting lower, right? Because we
Yeah.
know it's a very specific audience it's aiming for, right? It doesn't mean that it's not gonna be successful. It's just we have to set our expectations appropriately, right? Like that this kind of game appeals to this type of audience. It's a smaller group, and that audience may go to the larger game piece, but we're still serving an audience that we can serve, and we're building a community from that piece, right?
You know,
But it's knowing your community and learning from it. But
absolutely.
but my biggest fear always for folks when they go into this, because it is ambitious, is you create a product that it doesn't resonate with anybody. But if you're slowly doing little tests and seeing if it does resonate and there is an audience for it and there are people that really love it or enjoy it and they come out and they say it, then go for it, right?
Yeah, I love that approach too, because if you think about it, folks, it's not much different than what you probably are or should be doing. I would at least suggest with your games, which is approach it like validate. Like you have this theory, you have this hypothesis. Oh, maybe there's a demand in the market for this type of game, right? So what are you doing to further validate that concept, right? And then this is something to tell a lot of my clients too, is like have like a check balance process. When you hit the certain threshold, say, is it doing this or not? Like, those
Yep.
fun infographics people like to share all over the place and LinkedIn, like if you do this, then go here. If not, and follow this trail.
Yeah,
It's kind of like that in a way, if you really
it
want to
is.
simplify
It is.
it. And what you just shared, Chris, that process is no real different when it's like, okay, let's put something out there and see if it works. And I love also the point you made about don't do it just to do it, because that can get you in so much trouble in terms of like taking on so much more risk, a lot more responsibility. Like so many things can get into that if you just don't simply. To summarize what you said, it really comes down to the intent and alignment. Like just because you can afford this certain art style, but is completely different than what's consistent with your IP and your game and everything else, it might not be the right move. And maybe that's a sign that it's not the right move at this moment, but at least you're leading with the right direction and decision making, as opposed to let's just push it through because
Yep.
we have some people coming through that are interested in it. But that's fine. Build on that then. There's probably lots of ways you can do that, which I think is kind of relates to our next question in terms of, how can indie teams build partnerships or even collaborate with other creatives to expand their IP? Because I'm sure there's lots of different creative ways you can do this outside of just
There is.
outright hiring people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, hiring people works too.
Yes, it does. I'm
Like,
not saying no.
yeah. But I mean, again, if you don't want to tackle it internally, right? I highly recommend chatting with, like, there's a lot of really awesome small like animation studios that you could, and you don't have to do like, let's don't do a 30-minute, do 30 seconds, right? Get a 30-second animation, throw it on TikTok, right? Work with some animation teams or whatever, and just see like, hey, is there viability for this? Same thing for music, right? You can reach out to, there's a lot of audio composers out there. I talked to a million of them. They're all great. Like, I love them all to death. Please keep talking to me. I enjoy talking to you. But again, like, you can work with them to create, like, produce music and so forth, right? You don't have to go out and license something or do covers and so forth. That's very expensive, so don't necessarily do that. I learned that the hard way. But like, there are people to approach with and work with, right? So if it's not, there are a lot of experts in other mediums, like there's comic book, find there's a lot of awesome comic book writers out there that love to do these kind of these works and so forth, and the rates are actually very reasonable. Same with comic book artists, right? But definitely find people who this is what they do, right? And come to them with, like, show them what you're working on and see if you resonate with each other, and do some test work with each other both ways, right? I always recommend paid tests, but everybody's mileage varies, and it's a tight budget world these days. So as long as you're respecting each other's work and what the value is, work something out. But there's a lot of options out there. There's a lot of folks that probably might resonate with your IP or whatever and want to do cool stuff. Maybe they want to make statues for you, or I've had talks about like action figures, physical copies of things, like all kinds of tokens and so forth that go into the world. Like, there's a lot of fun stuff you can do. You don't have to do it alone. I guess that's really the point, right? Like, you don't have to try, like, that lowers the risk too, right? Especially if they're putting skin in the game as well, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
It's funny because as you're saying this, I'm like thinking in so many different ideas on how else to make this work too. Like, I mean, you have a lot, I mean, there's definitely a good component with collaborations with like teams, agents, even these small studios that you're speaking of and such, right? But then I'm thinking like, what if you're getting some momentum and having community, and you have some individuals that are producing some, user generated content, like some really good art style and stuff, and be like, hey, and then maybe that could be a starting point in terms of part of like the validation process. Like,
Mhm.
hey, you're doing this really cool. Could we like maybe, I don't know, commission some artwork from you? And I'm sure if they're doing it for free already, that they would just
Love to do it for
yeah,
paid, right?
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly, right? Like, what do you want? I'll do any well, hopefully they don't give themselves away, but the point is, like, that could open up an opportunity, and then from there, that could be a very, very low cost way to further validate, like, show, "Hey, we did this, like, one-page scene from a comic," like, and then people are like, "Wait, you're making a comic?" And then just see what the attention's like, and we're like, "No,
Exactly.
we just did one page." Just see, like, we thought it would be fun. We didn't have any anticipation, like, like, wink wink, of doing a comic, but it seems like you guys would really want one. Let's and there you go. Maybe you could
Yeah.
further explore those things. Like, there's so many really cool and interesting ways to do that. And what's better than to leverage your community in some
Mhm.
respects too, if you're able to, or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah, and again, always in a respectful manner. Like I always
yeah,
feel like, like you said, hopefully they're not giving away. Like, don't take
yes,
advantage of your community. Reward your community, treat them with respect, like make them a part of it, feel like involved, right? Careful with that to a point, right? There needs to be
yes,
some separation because I think sometimes there almost becomes a expectation like you owe us kind of thing because we're your community. And I think, there's to a point to that, right? But
absolutely.
you know, but yeah, 100% that. And then I think, something to explore also is if you want to lower the risk a little bit and you really want to see, another way to validate crowdfunding. Like
That's
like I said, we did a
going through my
backer
head
kit
too.
back in yeah, we did backer kit back in September for our tabletop RPG. We doubled the amount that we were looking for, and we still have pre-sales on it. So we were able to demonstrate a number of things. We validated that there was enough interest to produce the product that we wanted to produce. We doubled and tripled our social media like connection with people, and it was a really easy way for us to. And this is actually something else that goes back to the transmedia. Why I think transmedia is important. It's a great funnel for getting double, triple, quadruple sometimes effort out of expenses.
Hmm.
So like when we did the backer kit, not only did we get the people to show their interest into the tabletop RPG, but a number of those folks wishlisted our game and then followed our social medias. And then, and it's like, it only cost me the ad spend on the one thing and it went across multiple places. So, that's just something just to keep in mind, right? Even, all of our stuff is connected on purpose because again, we don't think it's going to be a 1-for-1. We know there's a funnel, but it's a pretty, it's a pretty decent, like the funnel doesn't get super narrow at the bottom. It actually is pretty wide, right? The number of people who based off of, they're willing to click on an ad to go to the page to learn about more, they're more likely to click on the other things because they're interested or excited about it. And again, it's
Right.
all validation, right? Just showing that you
And
have a community, there's people interested in this and they want to see or know about more. Like we had a number of people that early ads that were like, I want to see a TV show about this. I want to see an animation. I'm like, I would too, man. Like, give us some money. Like, but that's encouraging too. Like you want validation, right? So
Exactly. And I love the point too about like what you said there about widening your funnel. Because if you think let's like take that analogy a little bit further where let's say, you have a funnel and at the bottom is just a game. And the game is, let's say, purchasing the game, right? But now that funnel can potentially widen because you have a game and let's say you have some type of like, you know, offshoot of TTRPG relating to
yeah,
the thing. And let's say you have a comic because you did the validation, there's enough there. So now that funnel's getting bigger. So and then people can keep coming back to it or different stages. And now because, oh, I bought this game and now I want to buy the video game. Now I'm interested in the music
hmm
and like there's so many other great things. And in a day and age where sustainability is very hard to achieve, especially with the way the industry is going and everything right currently, why not do anything you possibly can to at least increase and I just talked to someone about this yesterday. Why not do what you can to increase the number of assets that you have that are
yeah.
serving other people? You're rewarding those players, like you said, and then bringing it back. Like that's
It's
one way to help
you,
reduce risk.
yeah. Well, you reduce risk, and then I mean the thing is it's like, well, what if I create this extra stuff and then nobody engages with it? Okay, yeah, but I mean you should be validating earlier, right? Like,
Exactly. Yep.
right? But the thing that I think is most important is there's this zeitgeist, right? I love that word, right? There's this moment where like something's super popular, and then people start searching for anything else that's there. And if you already have it there, and they don't have to wait 10 years for you to finally do the animated series on Netflix for it, like, there's a video, so I was looking at the camera, but there's obviously still an audience for that, but imagine that audience when it was at its height. You know what I mean? And I think that's really the key here, is that a lot of folks wait until after the height to catch the crest, right? It's the whole like surfing analogy, right? Like there's a point in the wave and they're catching it still that they can ride it in, but there's a better point where they could have been a lot higher and riding that wave a lot longer, and they missed it. And I think it's okay. Don't get me wrong. Like, they're not doing bad. They're still doing really good. But the thing is that there's a lot more that they could have been doing earlier to catch into that, right? And this is where I say they're leaving money on the table kind of thing, right? And I think, obviously, like, not everything's going to hit it, right? And I don't say, like, don't, but plan for it. Be ready for it. Like, if anything else, like, if you can't afford it right now, at least have a idea that if somebody were to come to, like, if your game took off tomorrow, and somebody were to come to you and go, hey, have you ever thought about doing this or whatever? You could say, yeah, this is what we're thinking, as opposed to waiting for somebody else to be like, oh, you haven't? Well, let's go back to the drawing board. And then like 2 years later, and then, your game was selling this here, and this is where people were looking for it. And now, because again, there's so many games out there, so much coming at them. If you don't have something ready, you miss out on something. Maybe not everything, right? But you're missing out on more that you could have had.
I have to say that as you were saying that, like, what it reminded me of too is there's this, I recommend people getting this because I think it could help out a lot. It's not game specific, but there's this book by Jenny Blake called Free Time. It's Lose the Busy Work, Love Your Business. And it's about working with small teams, most indies, and learning how to leverage things. And one of the key, there's lots of amazing things in this book, but one of the key things I call out to is like, just what you said, Chris, is like, plan ahead and anticipate that like best case scenario. Plan for the best case scenario, within your means and stuff. She's very mindful of that. But plan for that, because if that opportunity comes, like you just said, that wave, and hey, sure, you could catch it at that certain point and it's still good and there's nothing wrong with that. But what if you were positioned in a way that you could catch it right at its prime moment and everything? Like, and the thing is, sometimes that can be a lot for us to maybe think about or visualize. Like that's why lots of people have difficulty with conceptualizing or understanding numbers when it involves like space, because things are so massive. But it's that type of stuff that can happen and can be difficult to visualize when that moment in the wave that you describe could be like 5, 10, 100x more, but we don't necessarily see it as such, and it's hard to get definitive numbers there. But to your point, and that's why I was sharing that book too, because these are all really important things to consider. And when you call out, when you say leaving money on the table, it could be more than you think.
Yeah, that's the whole thing, right? Yeah, 100% that.
And you're better, and like you said, you're better to be in a position that can be prepared for that type of stuff. And if it doesn't happen, hey, it doesn't happen, but you're still in a better position than you're not. And of course, like you said before, that validation is also important. You just don't want to do it for the sake of doing it with hoping that could happen. Have some type of backing behind it. So in light of all these things too, and by the way, quick, I will share that book in the show notes for anybody who's interested. But yes, so in light of everything else, I want to kind of go into now, making transmedia kind of work for your brand, because a big part of what you were talking about earlier was like the importance of how this plays into your brand, not just the fact of, hey, we have all these assets and we can serve people and make some more money, yay, but there's got to be more to it too. So how would you say that like transmedia actually really like strengthens a game's brand and even, let's say, increase player engagement? And I mean, if you have any examples, that'd be cool too.
But I think the key is for transmedia is the negative space, right? It's the empty space, right? So you need to create a world that has a lot of empty space that you can write and continue to fill in. And of course, I think the best example out there is Star Wars. And back in the day, there was a bunch of books, right? They were called Tales from Mos Eisley Cantina, Tales of the Bounty Hunter, Tales whatever. There were these books that are, I don't probably considered part of the continuity nowadays, but anyway, they were great books. And what they did is they just told stories of like background characters, right? Like, so all the characters that were just in the background of Mos Eisley Cantina and the original Star Wars, they just told stories about like, hey, this is what Hammerhead did, and this is what this guy did, and this is what this guy did, and the same with the, and they were just additional stories that kind of built on the world, and it gave you, you know, more details of what's going on. You know, the one of my favorite transmedia that people wouldn't even maybe consider transmedia is the like Pitch Black, right? And the Chronicles of Riddick.
Yes,
When you watch
yes.
Chronicles of Riddick and you look around and you're just like, you see like these statues in the background. There's a whole history there, right? And it makes you curious because they wrote this stuff out because, you know, Vin Diesel's a big nerd, and they came up with like about a lot of this stuff, and you feel it when you see the story. Like you realize that there's stuff that you're like, oh, I wonder, because it helps like creating transmedia and creating these extra stories and details to your world help build the world out and make it more believable and lived in, and help like resonate with your audience. And so they really feel it and they get excited about it and they want to learn more and know more about all those different things.
You know, as you're sharing that too, I'm kind of curious, like, because I'm sure, again, some people's minds is probably like, well, what about the cost and things like that? So if we're looking at things from a cost-effective perspective, what are ways indie studios can, let's say, explore transmedia, in particular from a storytelling perspective? Because weaving these things together, I think, can also be a bit different than simply just having different assets to get like
Sure.
like how does that alignment happen, that actual connection, especially with the example you just provided with Riddick, because I think that one is a little bit more detailed, immersive, and kind of relates to the whole storytelling, almost like lore is another way that we could probably view that too.
Well, one of my favorite quotes from a friend of mine, which I don't know if he was the original, but Rich Dansky once said, is that writing is cheap until it isn't. Right. And so the whole idea is that, you know, if you do write out the worlds and don't spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, right? There's a compliment, right? You write enough details about your world that you have enough hooks and things to tell your story, but you leave enough space that you have the room, like I said, the negative space, the room to like add in more details and so forth, which don't confine you or write you into a corner, right? And obviously, the more planned out or the more points that you can create to kind of reference to, the easier it is to, you know, keep expanding on it. Obviously, there's a number of IP and brands out there that have had to rewrite that or retcon things that they said or done just because it, you know, it didn't work for how they wanted to go with the future of it. But I still think there's enough world building that you can do up front and just get it as nicely filled in or whatever. And again, there's professionals to work with on that, right? There's a number of narrative designers and writers I think are underappreciated. Even though a big part of my career has been being a narrative person or whatever, I used to joke about it all the time as well. But I think they're underappreciated on just how important they are to the game design, the game world, and everything else. So, you know, narrative is a big part of it. So getting the story right, getting the world right, spending some time fleshing that out, right? Like it's a big part of. Luckily, I work with a couple other folks that are really, really good at this. And they bounce off my crazy ideas as a creative director and flesh them out even further when we're able to extrapolate it out of my head. It is zoom it out. But
But that's such a great point though, is what you said, and you know, paraphrase here is just, you know, leave yourself the space to expand. Because if you're, well, one, if you're spending all that time trying to fill in every possible like gap, then it makes it hard to expand upon these things. And if you're doing that, you're also just spending a lot of time doing that instead of probably a million other things that you need to be doing too. So I absolutely love that. You know, as we get close to closing here, you know, what advice, you know, would you give, let's say in particular a small studio that's considering transmedia for their first time? I'm like, is there a good place to start? I mean, I'm sure again that validation process will come in handy, but what's a good place for anyone who's really wants to do this, has the right intent, and is relatively small?
yeah, focus on your main character, right? See if that's relatable, if people relate to that character, and if there's more that they can do. So, you know, you have a main character, take your key art, take, you know, concept art, put it out there, see if people resonate and relate to it, tell their story, and again, get more of that, like, do they feel like there's a connection there? Or if it's not that character, other characters, right? But it's really simple stuff to do. Go on Instagram, put your little square together, post it up there, put a few details up there, spend $10 on an ad and just see if it connects to folks and people click on it and like it or whatever. That's really the easiest thing I can say that like is very low cost, very free, very easy for you to just put it out there. But put it out there sooner than later. Don't wait. And don't think you have like $1 million idea and that everyone's going to love it and then be surprised by it at the last minute. So,
I love that one. And one thing, and I want your thoughts on this too, because I'm trying to be mindful of, let's say there's games or people creating experiences that don't necessarily have characters.
Okay.
Right. So let's say, here's a good one. Maybe it could, but let's say maybe a city builder or something where it's more of a very cozy styled game that's like a cozy city builder. Let's say that.
But those are usually visually impressive, right?
Yes.
So like take a screenshot, or even a concept shot of like how you want it to look or whatever, and get a feel for it, right? Write a little story to go along with. It doesn't have to be a story. Like a couple sentences could tell a story about what the intent is for that. Put it on, again, Instagram, throw it on the Reddit, throw it into like communities or whatever. Like again, throw it onto Twitter, X. Again, we get close to scum and villainy as we go into those areas, but But if you can find fans there and people that'll click on it and resonate with it, you're doing good. And it's also, you want validation in both ways. You want to be validated that your idea is great, but you also want to know sooner than later if it's crap.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Like, and so the sooner you're going to get, and I think it helps toughen you up because you're always going to get like one of the very first responses I got to an ad that we posted on Facebook was a pig taking a poop. It was a GIF of a pig taking a poop. Sticks with me today. But like, I was like, cool, we're going to get people who don't like or whatever, right? There was no comment or whatever. It was just that GIF, right? And then I was just like, all right. But then we got a million other responses that were very positive or whatever, right? So you have to realize that you're not going to resonate with everybody. And you want to just make sure you resonate with more people than you don't resonate with, right? And I think that's part of the validation process as well. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you too for providing more details around like, because I think when you're saying like focus on a narrator, I'm also interpreting that as a way as like your theme or your setting or whatever, it can be you can personify, it can be a character, and it's likely that it can relate or align with the player too. So it's almost like in a way indirectly they are the character, right? So there's so many.
Well, at that point they are.
Yeah. There's so many different creative ways. So again, like we've been talking about this whole show, is like really looking beyond being open-minded and stuff at these opportunities and stuff that abound with these transmedia worlds we can create. All really cool, exciting stuff. So I know you just gave some advice there, but are there any other types of tips or suggestions you'd have for listeners today based off of what we talked about? Because I know we discussed a lot.
Yeah. I was going to say, have a plan. And then the other one is really actually do some competitive analysis, please. Like do a little bit of competitive analysis, see what else is out there, see what's worked for other folks, see what's failed, right? There's a lot of learnings in seeing where people have stumbled and not executed properly, right? And usually that's because they didn't plan enough or they didn't validate their ideas early enough, right? So I think there's a lot to be said, whether it's transmedia or if it's just games in general. Find your audience, validate that audience, and make sure that what you're doing actually resonates with the audience that you think is out there, and just find out that they exist. And then once you do find that audience, cultivate that audience and grow that audience, because that's your community. And the thing you're going to learn if you're an indie studio and you've never published a game before, publishers can't build a community for you. Only you can. They can like cultivate that. They can use your community once you've built it, but they're not going to build that for you. So that's going to be on you. And I think going forward, it's going to be 100% on you. You're not going to find that kind of support otherwise. So, take all these little opportunities to build that community, validate your ideas, and make great product for them.
Awesome. Absolutely love it. And such great tips there to move forward with. Chris, I can't thank you enough for being here today and sharing all your knowledge and experience. Hey, if people want to reach out, connect, learn more about your studio, about the other services you provide, what are some links or other details that we can share with people?
Well, hopefully they're all in the show notes, but in addition to the show notes, definitely go to Play on Words Studios, that playonwordstudios.com. That's where you'll find all the information about Shadow City Mysteries, the tabletop, the visual novels, the main game itself. And then if you're interested in listening to my podcast or reading my blog, go to pressstartleadership.com. And I'm Christopher at either of those. So if you want to send me an email, always happy to chat. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the original Christopher Mifsud on LinkedIn. So look for the guy with the beard. And always happy if you're new in the industry, been in the industry forever, just want to chat. Always open to set up like a quick call just to, see how I can help you. So
awesome. Absolutely love it, folks. Check out Chris. Those places will be listed in the show notes. And Chris, it's just been really great and fun talking about this stuff. Really appreciate your time and sharing all this with us.
Likewise. Yeah, good fun. Thanks.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.